I think there's no better place to start than a great quote from the biologist and broadcaster David Attenborough. Nature is our biggest ally and our greatest inspiration. And I think something people are often frustrated about with biology compared to, say, software is that it's very complex and it can be really difficult to untangle. But I think we can really turn that complexity into a strength, and we can actually leverage billions of years of evolution, all the complex biology that's going on around us, within us, to actually learn how to build microscopic technologies that can actually benefit human health and human life. And I'm going to tell this story through the lens of a very specific technology that you may have heard of called CRISPR. So CRISPR was invented by a co-founder of my company, Dr. Jennifer Doudna, over at the University of California, Berkeley. And I think it's a really great story of how we can leverage nature to actually advance science. So if you haven't heard of CRISPR, the way I like to think about it is that your genome is a giant Word document, and it's 2 billion letters. And in some ways, it's a very simple Word document. It only has 4 letters in it, A, T, C, and G. And in other ways, it's incredibly complex because it actually codes for all of us. And we all have like so many differences. We have so many similarities. And I think that kind of code of life is what we call it, is one of the most interesting things that we can actually manipulate, both within ourselves, within animals, within plants, within the world at large. And CRISPR allows us, for the first time, to programmatically actually look at that Word document and actually kind of treat it like a Word document. So we can actually find and replace any sequence in that. So it's this kind of, CRISPR is this combination of kind of Word and Google. It allows us to search anywhere in the document and then actually change the sequence to anything that we want. And we'll talk about some different applications of this. There's all sorts, anything from obviously human health, where you want to cure genetic diseases, or agriculture, where maybe you want to make crops that are able to grow faster or hardier in different environments. So the story of CRISPR, though, starts with nature. Actually, it starts with yogurt. Some of you may have had yogurt this morning. So actually, all the bacteria and microorganisms around us, very similar to us, have an immune system. But for bacteria and microorganisms, that immune system is called CRISPR. So this was first discovered in yogurts, and these microorganisms had this very interesting property where if you injected them with viruses, which are kind of the natural enemy of not just us, but bacteria as well, then they would actually be able to chop it up and defend themselves against this invading virus so that the virus couldn't turn them into a factory for more viruses. And as it turns out, that technology that was in these bacteria was the basically beginnings of CRISPR. And the way CRISPR works is really cool. So there's this part of it that's the protein. We call it Cas9, something you may have heard of before. And basically the way this protein works is that it's programmed with a thing called a guide RNA, and that's the kind of hairpin-looking thing with the red box that's on top. And basically the guide RNA tells it, I want you to bind to this specific sequence. That's the search function. That's the Google part of it. And when it binds to that specific sequence, the protein, the Cas9, has these tiny molecular scissors that literally press the DNA together to cut it. And that's the replace part. And through some complex mechanisms, by cutting the DNA, you can kind of replace it with anything that you want. So it's this really beautiful system where evolution created this technology for the immune system of bacteria, where when they saw a virus, or when any bacteria saw a virus, they would say, hey, you need to create this guide RNA to defend against that virus if it ever comes back again. So it has hundreds of different guide RNAs in any one bacteria. And then they're kind of constantly monitoring, and if they ever encounter it, they would actually just kind of chop up the virus. But the really great insight was that we could rip this kind of CRISPR technology out of the bacteria, and we could actually, through a lot of engineering and other work to make it kind of functional outside of the bacteria, we could turn it into the world's most powerful genetic engineering tool, so that we can actually use it and inject it into plants or animals or even humans and actually change our DNA in a very specific, very safe, and very reproducible manner. So this is something that was first invented back in roughly 2012, 2013. And what's really exciting is that actually today there's now an FDA-approved drug for sickle cell disease using this technology to actually potentially cure the disease. And then there's all sorts of applications in agriculture and elsewhere. So the technology has really taken off, and it's already having a huge impact today. That being said, there's still big limitations. And one of the biggest limitations is that when you're doing this type of editing kind of in a petri dish or outside of the body, you can control all these different factors, and it's relatively easy. Nothing in biology is easy, but easier. But the ultimate way to use this technology would be if you could inject it into, for example, our bodies, have it go to any specific cell, make a very specific change, and then safely go away forever. And that's been really difficult to get it into the body, into every cell for various reasons. And then the second one is really making sure it only makes the specific edit you want and nothing else. This is called off-target effects. And then the final one is that you can imagine if your genome's a Word document, there's all sorts of changes you might want to make. Sometimes you want to delete a sentence. Sometimes you might want to insert a paragraph. Sometimes you might want to change just a single letter. And these are all different types of edits that you can do. And the original CRISPR technology was really only kind of good at deleting a sentence, which is very, very useful, but it's not everything. So at Mammoth, the company I co-founded with Jennifer and her lab, we're really focused on addressing these challenges so we can kind of deliver on the full promise of genetic medicine. And the way we do that is, again, going back to nature. So we've actually compiled these giant data sets with billions of proteins from the tree of life, so we can say, okay, are there other CRISPR technologies across all these different microorganisms that would potentially solve those problems? So we actually start with just these samples from all over the world, anything from like a hot spring to fecal matter from animals to, this table probably has microorganisms on it, no offense. And basically you can then create this giant database of all these different billions and billions of proteins, and you can use machine learning to sort through and say, are there any kind of CRISPR technologies in the DNA of these different organisms? And then we actually have a whole floor of our building that has nothing but high throughput liquid handling robots that run thousands and thousands of experiments at a time. Because often you're wrong. For whatever reason, what you think you're pulling out is not actually something functional, and you need to either iterate on it a bunch or try something else. So we've been doing this now for basically a decade, and we've been able to create all sorts of CRISPR technologies, like thousands and thousands of different CRISPR technologies, many different types of edits on top of this. And what we're focused on is applying it to therapeutics. And the other thing I'll mention on this story of kind of leveraging nature is that with the more recent advances in things like generative AI, there's been yet another shift. So when we started, it was quite simple. There's still very complex machine learning involved, but it's really what we call ortholog discovery. It was, are there CRISPR systems in nature? Can we rip them out, do a bunch of engineering, and kind of turn them into something useful? But fundamentally, it was trying to kind of borrow a little bit more directly from nature. Then, with the first kind of advent of these more generative models that were made most famous by companies like OpenAI and Anthropic, you can kind of reimagine nature, but it rhymes. So you would say, hey, there's this CRISPR system in nature. Can you kind of tweak it around the edges, find something that's similar but better? And that's very powerful, but you're kind of still doing things that rhyme with what originally was found. And now what's really exciting is that in the last few years, I think we've really been able to go even beyond nature and really start to generate things that look nothing like what you find naturally, which is incredible. And you train these models with nature, so you leverage the billions and billions of data points, but they actually find parts of a potential tree of life that evolution never explored. And I think that's really incredible and in some ways surprising. So I think that this is kind of the frontier of the space, is how do we leverage the data of nature to then go beyond anything that nature's actually created. So at Mammoth, we've now developed a whole portfolio of these CRISPR technologies that allow us to deliver on really the promise of genetic medicine, which is to be able to do any edit in any cell. And that is just a sea change in terms of how we think about biology, how we think about life, and how we can think about human health. And I think that the obvious place to start is rare diseases of high unmet needs. So there's many, many genetic diseases. The common phrase about rare disease is that rare disease is not rare. There's so many different rare diseases. Almost everyone in this room probably knows someone that has some sort of disease of this category. And they can be incredibly debilitating, things like Huntington's disease. They can be lethal. And they are a really great use case for these genetic technologies where you can actually go in and change the root cause of the disease to permanently cure it. So from the patient's perspective, the way this technology works is that they come into the doctor's office, they get a single injection, they go home, and then for the rest of their life, they never have to worry about the disease again. It's a completely different way of thinking about healthcare instead of taking a drug for the rest of your life. And it's also directly addressing the cause of the disease. So that's kind of the base of the pyramid, and I think there's a huge amount of good that can be done for the world addressing that. Next is more common diseases. So if we think about what are the big causes of mortality in the world, well, in the Western world, it's heart disease, right? Triglycerides, lipids, things like that. What if, using the same technology, we could give you an injection that doesn't cure an acute disease like Huntington's disease, but actually makes you 70% less likely to ever have a heart attack the rest of your life? How many lives could we save, right? And how much money could we save the healthcare system from not having people coming into the hospital, right? So that's common disease, and there's so many targets there. And I think heart disease is one. You can even think about kind of more exotic things, like what if back pain could be cured by permanently removing the source of that pain from the back, just blocking the pain receptors there, things like that. And then, and I think this is the frontier, and I think this is where summits like the World Government Summit are very interesting, because this final frontier really requires input from stakeholders beyond scientists and beyond companies, because it really starts to push the boundaries of, I think, what people have thought about our own biology. And that's what I call health defense and enhancement. So this could be things like, what if with a single injection you could reduce your lifetime risk of cancer, right? There's certain animals that have many copies of things like P53 and are much less likely to get cancer. Or what about more cosmetic things, about regrowing hair, permanent Botox? What if you only needed to sleep 3 hours a night instead of 8? What if you could build muscle without the side effects of steroids or going to the gym? So these are things where it's very possible, but we have to think as a society, which ones do we want to push forward, and how do we want to make these accessible, not just to the few, but to the many? So before I end, I'll point out another element that I think puts this into context, which, for those that don't know, for the first time recently, Eli Lilly became the first trillion-dollar biotech company. I think this was surprising to many people in some ways, but Lilly is most famous for a particular drug that maybe many in the room know, called GLP-1s, Wegovy, Ozempic, et cetera. And I think something that, honestly, I didn't fully appreciate until I actually looked at the data is that if you look at the revenue from this basically one drug, okay, from 2023 till now, for both Lilly and their main competitor, Novo Nordisk, one thing that's really striking, we all know and love OpenAI, right? Generative AI, it's going to be $1 trillion company probably. The revenue from ChatGPT pales in comparison, both in terms of absolute value and slope of growth, to a single drug, GLP-1s. And I don't think people realize this, but I think the important, and when people in the biotech space look at this, they're like, oh my God, we need to build another GLP-1. That's not the lesson here. There's a lot of people building GLP-1s. It's an amazing drug, and they'll improve. The lesson here is that as biology is starting to get into the ability to modify human health beyond specific disease, beyond just a single disease like Huntington's disease, and actually do things like change the risk of heart attack, change weight, et cetera, these actually are far bigger markets, both financially and in terms of societal impact, than I think anyone is going to realize. And GLP-1s are just the beginning. Imagine if you had something that could do the same thing for the risk of cancer. Imagine if you had something that could do the same thing for muscle building or sleep or any number of things that you can imagine, hair loss. So I think that we're going to see more and more examples of this, and I think this is the first kind of canary in the coal mine about what's happening in biology and how biology is going to transform this next century, similar to how computers transformed the previous. So with that, I'll just leave you with some kind of final thoughts on biology at the frontier, and just encourage everyone to think about, when we live in a world where biology is as programmable as a computer was 30 years ago, how should we deal with that? Like, what are the things that we as a society, as different societies around the world, want to pursue? And how can we make that as accessible to everyone as possible? Thank you.